Harbinger to me is what one might have gotten if, when hip hop was formed, it was considered and taken seriously.
Hmm.
I think that much of what Black people make is initially written off, almost always
Yeah.
written off as insignificant or silly or childish. Um, Harbinger is kind of posited, from my perspective, as something that comes from an alternate universe of
Mm.
hip hop music making, where instead of hip hop culture being seen as a fad that would eventually go away, which is how it was regarded
Yeah.
initially. I remember that time period very clearly. If instead of that, it had been seen as even art music, the way much of white production is seen as artistic and novel. And if it had been given the credit it deserves for being novel and creative, um, what kinds of experimentation might we have seen? If we were to reach into that alternate timeline, what kinds of things might we have seen artists encouraged to be creative and encouraged to follow novelty as opposed to commerciality, mere commerciality? There's nothing wrong with commerciality. There's nothing wrong with one selling one's art, but there is something wrong when that becomes, in my opinion, there's something wrong when that becomes the key focus and the primary focus to make music that people will buy.
Yeah.
That being the driving force, because when you do that, when the marketplace drives your art, what inevitably happens is you stop making art and you start making commerce,
Mm.
and they don't sound the same necessarily.
Welcome to the Words Matter Pod with Akil Pinnock, a podcast dedicated to wordsmiths and storytellers. Once again, I'd like to say thank you to my homegirl Tiana at the Harvard Hip Hop Archive for putting this together, and thank you to the Harvard Hip Hop Archive for this collaboration. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking to one of the 2016, 2017, and currently the 2024, 2025 Nazir Jones Hip Hop Fellows at the Harvard Hip Hop Archive. He's written about race, politics, and culture for over 35 years for any publication you could think of. He's the self-proclaimed media assassin, hip-hop journalist, lecturer, researcher, radio personality, and producer. He's a member of the iconic rap group Public Enemy, might I add. He serves as an advisor to the Archives of African American Music and Culture at Indiana University and the Universal Hip Hop Museum opening in the Bronx, New York in 2026. That's next year. And the reason he's here today, he's the founder of Harbinger, an experimental hip hop turntablist septet research project designed to investigate turntable polyphony, polyrhythm, and polysemantics. Words Matter would like to give a warm welcome to Harry Allen. How are you today?
I'm well and blessed. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. I was just I just want to let y'all know I'm grazing over the list of Mr. Allen's achievements, but there's so many, but we have to get into them in the interview. Uh, what does all of those things that I just said mean? As far as describing Harbinger.
When you say all of those things, you mean all of the things you've said about Harbinger, or all the things you said about me?
About Harbinger, as far as it being a investigative turntable polyphony, polyrhythm, and designed to investigate polyphony, polyrhythm, and polysemantics. What does that mean to the average person?
Maybe not much. Those aren't words that people typically use. Those aren't words I typically use. But what they mean is, I guess, in essence, is that turntablism, and by that I mean the practice of hip hop DJs using turntables as instruments, as not merely devices to play back pre-recorded parts of music, which is interesting enough in itself,
Yeah.
but also to take those pieces of music or sound apart and to rearrange them actively. And then in the case of a turntablist septet, to find ways to recombinate those sounds, to combine them and make interesting new patterns. Um, what it means is that the turntablists in Harbinger pay attention to the rhythm of tone, the multiplicity of tones that the turntable can generate, the multiplicity of rhythms it can generate, and then particularly what it can do with speech. That speech underneath the turntable's hand can become, you might say, a form of non-speech. That
Mm.
it can become rhythmic, tonal speech. It can remain speech or become new speech. And by identifying those three areas, it's saying that all of these things are interesting. All these things are interesting in and of themselves, which is something I think many people understand in hip hop. They may, but we're making a statement about it. We're saying that they're drawing attention to it and trying to make those things stand out.
Yeah. In a way that this is production in a sense, right? Because hip hop is not a genre that was really created with traditional instruments. It was created by taking loops from break beats and popular songs of the 70s and looping them over and over again. So you're kind of still carrying on the tradition of traditional hip hop in a way because of the combination aspect. That that accurate?
Very much so. Um, it's very much rooted in the um, in the history of hip hop, and I like to say that it represents an alternate timeline. That Harbinger to me is what one might have gotten if, when hip hop was formed, it was considered and taken seriously.
Hmm.
I think that much of what Black people make is initially written off, almost always
Yeah.
written off as insignificant or silly or childish. Um, Harbinger is kind of posited, from my perspective, as something that comes from an alternate universe,
Mm.
hip hop music making, where instead of hip hop culture being seen as a fad that would eventually go away, which is how it was regarded
Yeah.
initially. I remember that time period very clearly. If instead of that, it had been seen as even art music, the way much of white production is seen as artistic and novel. And if it had been given the credit it deserves for being novel and creative, um, what kinds of experimentation might we have seen? If we were to reach into that alternate timeline, what kinds of things might we have seen artists encouraged to be creative and encouraged to follow novelty as opposed to commerciality, mere commerciality? There's nothing wrong with commerciality. There's nothing wrong with one selling one's art, but there is something wrong when that becomes, in my opinion, there's something wrong when that becomes the key focus and the primary focus to make music that people will buy.
Yeah.
That being the driving force, because when you do that, when the marketplace drives your art, what inevitably happens is you stop making art and you start making commerce,
Mm.
and they don't sound the same necessarily. Um, so yeah, in that regard, um, it is production in the sense that we mean production in hip hop, in the sense of creating sounds in parts and recombinating them to make a new composite sound. That's what we mean by production, and it is production in that regard. but not merely so.
Yeah. What did just to touch back on something you just said about when you're worried about the marketplace when you're creating art, it no longer turns into art, it turns into commerce. What did commerce music sound like in the early days?
Of hip hop?
Yeah.
It's a great question. Initially, there wasn't any such thing. And in a certain sense, it was all commerce because, well, initially hip hop was made for free in
Mm.
public areas. And this has been the history of black music in general, that it usually starts in public areas for free as a communal spectacle, as something that people do who are part of an area, geographic area, to socialize and to get together. And then you could say there was an early commerce period where people would pay to get into events.
Mhm.
They would pay to come see the L Brothers or to see the Cold Crush or
Which is
uh,
natural.
which is yeah. I guess it's natural. Well, money isn't natural, but certainly I think the drive to
Yeah.
acquire power for one's work is natural. Um, and I think that's what the early artists were doing. They were trying to spread their music. They were trying to test the um, the power of it. They wanted to know, you know, it's kind of like um, I got into writing, writing pieces for church, and I would often, almost always, write something, get up in front of the church, read it, and get a whole host of amens. And people would approvingly talk about what I wrote.
Mhm.
And then at a certain point, I asked myself, I said, people are always approving and giving me amens for what I write in church. But I wonder if they would react the same way if I was writing for a newspaper or a magazine. Not would they be giving me amens, would my church people be giving me amens, but would people respond, the people who are the natural audiences of a magazine or a newspaper, would they respond to my work that way? So I wanted to test it in a certain way. And I would say also that at that time, I wanted to, those artists wanted to test their work through a limited form of commerce. Um, you pay your money at the door, you give a donation, you come and see, the uh, Fantastic Five. Um,
It was donation based.
well, not donation based in the sense that you decided whether you wanted it to pay.
Oh, okay.
Donation based in the sense that that's how they tended to refer
All
to
right.
that early kind of pay. You would often say, "Come to the door, pay a donation." They'd use that word, much the way they use the term MCs to mean rappers, masters of ceremony. But these weren't MCs in the strict sense of the word. In the way that MCs had been used up to that point, they kind of bent it to their own work. But I guess what I'm saying is, I see a difference, certainly between it's almost like the difference between agribusiness, where massive companies ex, uh, uh, um, use technology, chemicals, patents to extort every piece of value from the ground, in which they sell you then within food that they've manipulated, and buying from a local farmer. I think in the early days, hip hop was like buying from the local farmer, which
Mm.
is one thing
Great analogy.
compared to what we see today, which is music which is almost often scientifically designed
Yeah.
in composition and length and character to pull some kind of audience. And that's what I mean by commerciality.
Mm.
Um, and of course, the more attenuated that process is, the more details the seller is regarding, manipulating, attempting to change, or to give attention to, the more commercial that process is.
Mm.
Because that's what commercial means.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Commercial means retail selling, and the more you're tending to the details of how to get this to sell, the more commercial it is.
Yeah. When hip hop turned into this mass commerciality um commodity,
Mm.
uh did you expect that? Were you surprised? Were you outraged? Were you um
Well, it
disappointed?
happened very slowly. It happened very gradually. It I mean, and also there were things that were happening that would be part of that commerciality, but at the time you necessarily didn't regard that way. So, for example, I remember that time period where, with disbelief, um, there would be a chart in Billboard for measuring hip hop records, and there'd be a chart for radio play, and they may still be organized that way. I don't know. I haven't looked in Billboard in ages, and certainly not for charts. But they would typically be inverted. So you'd see like a record on the hip in the sales area, in the R&B or hip hop sales area would be like at number one, but like it'd be number 40 in airplay.
Mm,
What was happening was that these records were selling without radio. And this was a new phenomenon because typically what happened is that these things were pretty much paired. Something that was selling at number 20 in sales would be somewhere around number 20 in airplay. But hip hop kind of inverted that and really shocked people because of this power that it had to generate acclaim and interest even without a radio, because you had this kind of underground structure of listeners and DJs and people playing records in their cars, things that you normally didn't use to give sales presence to records.
yeah.
So that was something that was part of hip hop's power, and that people like myself who were observing this back then looked on as part of its vitality and strength. Um, but we didn't know that these kinds of abilities would later be pulled to squeeze everything out of it. In
Yeah.
other words, we didn't know that the vitality of hip hop would not be used to create greater and more interesting varieties of it, or to um, create more opportunities for artists uh, economically, except within the existing structure. Um, and so that vitality was amazing to us, but it would just later be rounded off into making hip hop work as part of the recording business structure.
Yeah. That could be
None of hip hop's vitality was used to break it out into a new vision
yeah,
of art or music. It was just all to make it
more
useful for selling widgets.
yeah. Yeah. I, I know that in a way it's a blessing because people were able to create a livelihood for themselves. But
Yes.
but also, even while you're making that livelihood, you probably do, if you really care about the art form, you care about the culture, it can be frustrating seeing you be authentic, but you as the one person, you can't really control uh the culture being, I guess, replicated and then mass produced in an assembly line, type fashion while you're still trying to stay true to the roots of it.
Well, I think that this what you just described mostly comes out when artists try to do something different. When true artists try to take a different approach or create something with a new feeling, and are told by record labels or the A&R people at the labels that this isn't what they're looking for. And certainly by the time the artist has had a certain amount of success, not only does the artist tend to have a sense of what the audience wants or may want to hear, but the record company tends to feel they do too. And what was initially a process of artist initiative and inventiveness becomes a co-production in the sense that the artist now has people who have a vital interest in their success telling them to some degree what records that they should make or not make.
Mm.
And that can be really frustrating for many artists, especially many really creative artists, especially many artists who are kind of ascending, going up in terms of what they, in their popularity, in their sales. It isn't always a situation where as they become, you know, more as they become more visible, that the label says, hey, just do what you do.
Yeah.
Label typically feels they have an investment in what they're doing and want to pay very close attention to what that artist is going to make and release. And and that's apart from whatever, contracts or other relationships one has um, described in legalese.
Mhm. Okay. I don't want to, dwell on that too long, but
Sure.
I know you could talk about that for hours because you like first generation hip hop, so you definitely speak about that. Uh, you were a member of a rap group. I mean, you're not a rapper, not that I know of. But can you believe how far this culture came since the '70s when everyone started to fall in love with it?
It's easier to believe the longer you're in it, but I certainly, I, I, I always thought that hip hop would last. Um, I was not one of those people who actually was in doubt or when they were saying when conventional wisdom was that hip hop was a fad and it would eventually go away. I never took that idea. It wasn't even something it's not even I would say I didn't take it seriously. It was just something I knew people were saying, and it was like if people were saying the sky is green.
You
It's
tuned it
like
out.
that's something people are saying, but it's obviously not the case.
Hmm.
Um, I knew it would become bigger and more popular. I could not have foreseen almost anything we see today, and
Yeah.
I don't even feel like I completely know how big it is. I'm one of those people who still is surprised, when I see certain displays of hip hop's vitality, or when I see that there are big hip hop records in other countries, or um, when I see hip hop in commercials.
In
It,
stadiums.
I'm sorry.
In stadiums.
Yes, stadiums. And especially when I see like white B-level artists who are having big careers, like white artists who aren't Eminem. Like it reminds me that, or just today, like seeing fashion commercials where there's a little female rapper soundtrack in the background. In the past, that would have been a rock soundtrack. You would
Yeah.
have heard some wild guitar or something like that. Now it's almost a given you're going to hear rapping, and that's something that I certainly remember when that was not the case at all. And so that's my reference in a way. Like my the way I am most comfortable thinking about hip hop, actually, when I think about it, is that time period from when it began to the so-called golden era,
Hmm.
to right before Dre and then Puffy come to dominate the scene to a degree. Right before there, um, that's kind of like my reference point, for the art form. And so many things that exceed it, like are odd to me and strange. I didn't grow up in an era where hip hop was everywhere, where it was normal, where I remember when it didn't exist. So uh, all the things that come from it always existing as it has for many people. For many, we had the 50th anniversary of Cool Herc's innovations 2 years ago, and in 4 years we're going to 4 years it'll be the 50th anniversary of the release of Rappers Delight,
Yeah.
and Rappers Delight marks the beginning of hip hop as a commercial medium.
Hmm.
So anyone born after that has always lived in a time where you could buy hip hop,
Hmm.
and even before that remembers a time when you couldn't. So we have different reference points and references of what's real just based on those facts.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to stay in the early days a little bit before
Mm-hmm.
we get into the present.
Whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah, appreciate that. I interviewed one of the fellows, Dr. Holt, a few
Mm-hmm.
months ago back in March, and I asked him if he would have ever thought about how a fellowship in one of the most famous and prestigious universities is named after a rapper from a New York City housing project who didn't even make it to the ninth grade. This shows you how far we took hip hop and how far it'll continue to go.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for you as a native New Yorker who's seen Nas's career from the beginning to now, now he's in his 50s. He started when he was a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, how does it feel knowing that, you know, Nas's work from over 30 years ago really leveraged him into being who he is now and having a fellowship that, you're a member of and you're younger than him?
I may not be, um, but I would say to your question,
I mean, you're older than him. Sorry.
yeah, yes, I'm a bit older than he is, um, but I think um, I think on one hand I certainly do recognize what you're saying, Akil, that in a way none of this goes together. None of this actually goes together.
Yeah.
Um, and then on the other hand, I mean, Nas has um, a fellowship named after him because a a very wealthy um, white guy who came to love Nas's work
Mm.
and doubted in his name. So it really starts there. Like, how do very wealthy white guys come to love Nas's work?
That's the real question.
Yeah, it is a question. It is a question, and um, I don't know to what degree that's been researched or investigated. I mean, in other words, once that happens, all kinds of things. Once wealthy white guys want something, a lot of things become easy. You
Mm.
know, um, but what it was, in Nas's work, um, which is exemplary. It was and remains, especially the earliest work that he became known for. I wouldn't say more than the later work, but I'm just saying that um Illmatic is like a
Set a
standard.
standard. Yep.
It's a standard bearer in hip hop. I don't know if most people would say all the other albums or any of the other albums are as such, but it doesn't really matter because he made at least one album that that warped the timeline, that changed things. Um, so yeah, uh, why why that album had that effect on the person who endowed his fellowship? I don't know that that's ever been explained, or I don't know if he's ever spoken about it, or why hip hop, you know, why hip hop, quote unquote, crossed over. It was a music form that was initially enjoyed by non-white people in poor urban areas,
Hmm.
and it's still non-white people in poor urban areas that, for the most part, make up its artistic corpus. These are the people who mostly create it, who mostly determine how the culture moves. In other words, they're the ones whose responses to it matter most.
Yeah.
Matter most in terms of how it, what it then does next.
Yeah.
Like they're the ones who choose how we should regard what's being made. Um, and then like as I've often said, for me, being tied to the members of Public Enemy, my my first shock was seeing white guys wearing T-shirts with the Public Enemy logo on it.
And scream and fight the power.
Even before Fight the Power,
Yeah.
just the idea that white guys were embracing Public Enemy
Yeah.
because because Public Enemy was a black crew talking about black empowerment,
Mm-hmm.
which by definition under racism means white disempowerment, relatively speaking. And politically, I didn't understand why that flew. It might have been because those white guys weren't checking into it, or it could be because they checked into that message and they agreed with it. Or it could be they just liked the music, it was just, or just pissed off their parents. You know, maybe I
Could
should
be
have done more.
a lot of those things combined.
Could have been those things combined in many cases. Um, I didn't do the research certainly back then. I didn't start going around asking, and I don't know who did, and I don't know. Maybe someone should do that now, and say like why, like that question. But that whole question of, I guess to me, the way I settle the question of so-called crossover is really simple, and it's that one, black people are human beings, and so the things that human beings make are very compelling to other human beings,
Hmm.
and it almost doesn't matter what those things are. If you make it, some human being is probably going to be affected by it in some way, and probably some human being you're not expecting, because human beings are more alike ultimately than we are dissimilar. Um, that is to say, the way we classify human beings in our minds, that's a tall guy, a white guy, Albanian guy, a Dutch girl. The things that we have in the classifications we use that are useful to us for various reasons have nothing to do, for the most part, with the organism of being human, the organism of sensation, how we process ideas, etc. So things that we think won't cross over are more likely to do so,
Yeah.
to the degree that we don't inhibit them via those classifications we deem real.
Yeah. It's I mean, it was never a stranger to me that white people loved hip hop because I was born in '93, right? So
Mm,
I I don't know a time period in life when hip hop didn't exist. I don't know a time where there weren't white rap fans.
right,
And it's very common for me to go to a show now and most of the people there are white.
right.
I said in the interview I did with Dr. Holt, and I posted a clip on TikTok, and people were in the comments um, about something I said. Some guy sounded so outraged, but I said in the clip that of course, hip hop was created by black people in South Bronx, and it spread towards communities like the South Bronx all across the world. But hip hop wouldn't become hip hop wouldn't be what it is now if it didn't spread to the suburbs, right? Because
Mm-hmm,
that brought more revenue into
mm-hmm.
the culture, into the genre, right?
Yes,
So in order for rappers, if hip hop only stayed in the hood, nobody would be rich.
that's correct. I think that's correct. It wasn't only just money, but it was regard.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, money is a chief way I guess, cultures that in cultures where money is really important. Money is the chief way you show regard. But just the act of a kid sitting in his room with his door closed, blasting LL Cool J, a white kid,
Mm-hmm.
LL Cool J posters on his wall. There's a minimal kind of monetary output there, but that's a really significant cultural statement that also has impact. So there was a lot of regard, and that regard was followed with money from the so-called suburbs. When by suburbs, we tend to mean places where white people live together,
Yeah.
to the exclusion of most other people. And absolutely, I don't. It's pretty obvious, actually, that if you just look at the history of the music, it's pretty obvious that the importance of hip hop is 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 entangled with the importance of white regard for it.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the way the world. That's the story of the world after white people were invented.
Yeah, nah, for real. I mean, yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up too. Is that, the suburbs also aren't just white people. I grew up in a majority black suburb outside of New York City.
Hmm.
Um, you know, a lot there are a lot of similarities in my community that you could compare to what's going on in the city. It's just that
Yes, but not enough.
not enough, but it's just a slower environment. And there's a little bit more wealth because there's black home ownership. Um,
Yeah, and black professionalization, black professionals of
yeah,
higher incomes, and higher level of education. But the point is that if hip hop had gone from from the hood, so to speak, there, that would not have been as regarded as very significant for the most part.
yeah.
It was that the fact that a lot of white people. I remember when the Beastie Boys became known. I remember how when the Beastie Boys started to make records, MTV became wide open to rap. Like it hadn't been up to that point. It had been hair bands, and new wave. But when the Beastie Boys showed up, woo, my goodness, it was like welcome home.
Which is ironic in a sense because they're not even from the suburbs,
They're white though.
but they're white exactly. So it was easy for that to
The
depend.
suburbs paid attention to them because they were white.
Exactly.
And MTV knew that would happen and anticipated and cooperated with that.
Yeah. Do you think that we needed that? Like we needed that commercialization in a sense?
Well, that question has to do with to do what? To get to where hip hop is now? Absolutely. Yeah. It would have been, it would have been, it would have, I think without it, hip hop would have probably been something like go go.
Uh very niche and regional.
Very niche and regional and enduring and creative and compelling to its core audience, but something that, would be looked at kind of like, I think it was a hopscotch kind of thing. Like with white attention, hip hop kind of went, "Oh, let me show you what I can do," and then exceeded everyone's expectations, and that brought in even more attention, and then it exceeded them even more wildly. And I think that has a lot to do with how it grew and how it really grew so quickly and so powerfully and so widely, and how it came. It's a very strange thing to me that hip hop culture is the dominant form of music culture or popular culture or record sale culture that we see, Chanel ads with rapping in the background. Like that to me is just
Yeah.
that's not something I could have really I if I foresaw it, back in the days, I didn't see it happening widely. I could have certainly seen one commercial doing it, but I couldn't see a bunch of them doing it.
No, I mean, I understand you completely because if I was you, I would be surprised too. I mean, it's definitely something I mean, even me at my age,
Right.
just to think about that, because it wasn't even like this. It wasn't fully like this even 20 years ago.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. And I'm sure we could just look at, there are markers we could point to, that would show that.
So, like I added, you are a part of the Public Enemy ecosystem. You appeared on 3P albums. You might have been the first rapper adjacent person to translate into media full time. Now you see that all the time with rappers being in media. Um,
Hmm.
these days it's become the norm for someone who was on music to become media. How do you think your experience as a member of a hip hop group helped you as a journalist?
Well, uh, I would say first of all, um, I would say first of all, I'm trying to think. It's between one of two. It's between two things immediate that I'm not sure which is first. Being around the members of Public Enemy, the people who would become Public Enemy before they made records, that whole time period, which seems in my memory very long when I think about it. But when I did the numbers, it was really only about 5 years
Mm,
that we were all around each other before they made the records that would ultimately break them through the Public Enemy records. That whole period was a real education in thinking about hip hop. As I often say, um, the members of Public Enemy were the first people that I ever met that, besides myself, took hip hop completely seriously.
mm,
It didn't. They didn't foresee. They weren't involved to get girls or even to become rich or famous. They were engaged by the art form, by the possibilities of it, and that whole thing about it being a fad that was going to disappear was just not something we even ever brought up. I'm not saying like it was against the rules to bring it up. I'm just saying it just never. It's like I said, if we had heard that the sky was green, that people were talking about that, is that something we would have given any time? I don't remember us ever debating whether hip hop would last. It was a foregone conclusion for us that it would. I don't think any of us really foresaw how big it could become, but we knew it would become big. I would say that. So I would say being around them was an education in the theory, if you will, of hip hop, and certainly a way of thinking about it and a way of approaching it
mm.
as 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 anthropologists, as scientists. Um,
From a sociological perspective, too, I'm sure, right?
I would say that. I would say that not in the strictest sense of the word, not in a a PhD studies way,
Yeah.
but certainly thinking about its effect among people. Um, so there was a consistency in the way we talked about it. Bill, Stephanie, and Chuck, and Hank, and myself. There was a consistency in the way we kind of approached it and thought about it and lived with hip hop. But then I would also say that Chuck did something really amazing for me personally when he, as I now say, gave me a 10-second commercial on Don't Believe the Hype. I often approach him these days, and still to this day, I thank him for doing it and say to him, "You were doing God's work."
Mm,
And I don't use God's name casually. I'm a person of faith, and I wouldn't say that if I didn't really, really mean it, literally. And I say that because I'm I'm not really, to this day, even knowing the value of it, I'm not a really good person when it comes to promotion or self promotion.
yeah.
And Chuck saying that for me, I'm not saying he gave me a career, but he certainly gave me a much more visible one. It's not a visible the visibility I've been able to acquire because people heard my name on that record or know that I'm the media assassin.
Hmm.
It's not, even though I came up with that term, he's the one who popularized it. And it made a lot of things and still does, made a lot of things possible and easy for me that just would not have been that way. I'd have to do a lot more explaining
Yeah.
about my relationship to PE than I've had to do, just because he decided he wanted to do that. I didn't ask him to do it. It was just something he wanted to say. It worked in the record. He didn't use my name in every record, but he used them in a few, for which I'm grateful. And but that one primarily, because both he and Flavor, and then I speak on it. So it's kind of like when you say like how it benefited my work as a journalist. It's kind of like on one hand, there's the work we put in, socializing, talking, the time Hank came back after seeing Stetsasonic, raving about them, the time they played Houdini's Funky Beat in the studio in the Spectrum City studios, when they brought it, just listening to it, all sitting there listening to it together at high volume and definition, like all those moments, all those conversations we had just sitting around talking about rap records and the sounds of them and how they were put together. That was one kind of part of my development as a journalist. But then also Chuck did this thing by telling people that I should be paid attention to and heard, and that I was part of this collective. He made it absolutely official. And that also continues to be um, a great part of the opportunities that I've been afforded
Mm. Yeah, man. Shout out to Chuck D, man. Definitely,
forever.
yeah, forever. And then for me, just as a fan of hip hop my whole life, like Chuck D was just always like a when people talk about NBA legends, he's kind of like one of those guys in a sense. And you always look forward to Chuck
Yeah,
Chuck
he's
D.
one of those guys that doesn't come out of the position. He's like one of those guys that whatever the ranks go up and down, he's kind of like right still there.
Yeah.
He's very solid in that regard. Like he's beyond taste or fashion.
Hmm. And that's because the message was consistent. It's consistent to this day. And we've never seen him look funny in the light in any way. And I always look at Chuck D as you always look forward to what he has to say. And then he's still even very active on Twitter to this day too. So
Yeah,
yeah, man, shout
he's
out.
very much a man of the people.
Yeah.
He's very much a man of the people. He's not a celebrity in that regard. I mean, I guess he is in a certain regard because of the way people decide who are celebrities. But he's very much more a man of the people, and his concerns are artistic, creative, social. It's not about flossing or being big or visible, or it's not about any of that. He's really much like it's like his name Chuck D. It's like a name of a regular guy.
Yeah. You think that was that intentional based off like
I
him?
think it had to be, but I don't think it was something that he did to convey that. I think it's just who he is.
Yeah.
He's very much what you see is which the only thing that I think most people find different about him when they meet him is a lot of people have said they think when they finally meet him they think he's going to be bigger than he is or taller, and he's regular size. And I think it has to do with his voice. His voice makes it sound like he's going to be someone really big.
Nobody, you got that voice. No one has that voice.
Yes, that's correct. No, and that's I've often said that that's one of the things that PE certainly brought. That two lead vocalists who don't sound like anybody else,
Mhm.
either one of them, in one crew, which is really unique. I mean, as I've long said, the artists who are best known and most loved have unique vocal timbres.
Mhm.
They don't sound like anybody else, and you know who they are as soon as you hear them. And often when I hear a rapper who might be incredible, and there are many rappers that I think are incredible, but who don't have distinct voices, you can't say based on the sound of their voices who they are immediately. I typically say that person is probably not going to have as much success as they would want. When you
Mm.
hear Ice Cube or Snoop Dogg or Eminem or Chuck or Flavor, or Busta Rhymes, you
Yeah.
know who they are immediately. They don't sound like anybody else.
Mhm.
Q-Tip doesn't sound like anybody else. And that's really important for longevity and success. And I think even if you're a really good rapper, if your voice is not singular and distinct, MC Light doesn't sound like anybody else.
Yeah.
You know, um, I think otherwise it's going to be a real struggle. And of course, there are exceptions to this. Obviously, they're going to be. But I mean, even um, Megan the Stallion.
Yeah, she definitely has a distinct voice, super distinct.
Yeah, she does. You know,
Yeah. I want to get into the media assassin label, right? What exactly does that mean?
uh, so um, it's a title I came up with for myself because when I started writing, I wanted to describe myself as someone who saw mass media, as essentially hostile to the goals and objectives of Black people, and point. I wanted to put myself out as a counteroffensive.
Yeah.
I wanted to describe myself as someone who would act offensively on behalf of Black people through media, and I chose the idea assassin. I chose assassin and media assassin. Um, One, because they sounded really cool,
Yeah.
and in hip hop, you've got to have a cool sounding name for it to kind of get through, and this got through. And also because an assassin is a person who is smart, precise, businesslike, effective, doesn't create a lot of noise around him or herself, um, and it's never personal. It's he or she kills for a business or a political objective,
Yeah.
and so I wanted to suggest all those things that in terms of my work, I wanted my work to have a certain kind of fire to it and a certain kind of pointedness, and that metaphor worked, and it's endured.
Hmm. What in your work exactly you think embodies being a media assassin?
Well, I I would I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that, but I'll try. I think in as a writer that what I what I try to do in when writing is I try to be detailed. I try to be colorful. In other words, and by color I mean I try to write in a way so that when I say something, it sticks. It sticks in your cognition when you read it. At least one thing. I try to be innovative. I try to when I was writing regularly, especially writing about hip hop, I always tried to put at least one thing in there that, at least to my thinking, was a completely new idea. That was something I had not seen someone else say elsewhere. Um, Something that would stand on its own that way. I'm, I'm, I wasn't afraid to name and attack certain things and certain ideas, especially around race. I try to be very direct and not mush mouthed or mealy mouthed. Like I'll often hear people talk about white people and say other groups or other races, or they'll lower the voice and say people. And I just wouldn't do stuff like that. I wouldn't do stuff like that talking or writing. And I don't know. I think if I having to self analyze this, I think what I would say is that um, I often really just wanted to obliterate bad ideas. I
Mm,
really wanted to, even if not naming what those ideas were, I wanted to put forward a counter narrative, is what they'd call it today, a counter narrative, and do it so forcefully that bad ideas wouldn't have a chance.
yeah.
That those are the things I guess I would say. I wanted to write in a way so that whatever someone saw my byline, some little part in their brain would say something like, "Here we go again." Like I wanted my byline to become like coincidental with thoughts like that. Like they know that something's going to happen. Um, Once in a self description, I wrote that I wanted to get to the place where where reading my writing would be considered a seditious act. I've never gotten to that place, but that was kind of like an object that would have been the ideal to me. Like my articles would be one that if you saw my byline, you'd rip it off, stuff it in your jacket, read it under a candle, like writing that way.
It was something that would be something that would be banned in Florida under Ron DeSantis.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So, all right, you're saying that you haven't reached that yet, and you do reach
I
that.
haven't, and I don't think I ever will, especially because I'm not giving writing. I've ceased to work as a journalist for the most part.
Yeah.
It's not something I'm regularly practicing. I'm more interested, and and I guess you might say this is where Harbinger came in. And I gave a I don't know if you saw it, but I gave a part of being a fellow is giving a colloquium presentation.
Yeah, I was watching it.
And in that colloquium presentation, the one I gave it on March 12th, 2025, um, at the um, at the Hip Hop Archive and Research um, Institute, I talked about transitioning from journalism to where I am now, currently, where I'm more concerned with implementing ideas, implementing the the things I want to see in the world as opposed to writing about them. So in the past, I wrote about and would have written about the need for more experimentation in hip hop, and asked a question like, I don't know if I ever actually did ask this question, but I would have asked a question like, how come we don't see, any large turntable orchestras or combos or ensembles? That's the kind of question I would have asked writing about hip hop in some context. And I often did talk about the need for more experimentation. But instead, what I've decided to do is to just do it, to do the experimenting myself, to find ways to try and get the experiments happening. And that, especially currently, is more satisfying to me than writing about how hip hop should be.
Yeah. It seems like you were it was your mission to get on top of the narrative and whatever negative tropes and archetypes existed surrounding hip hop at the time. That's what I'm getting from what you're saying. Is that true?
Well, when I was writing, uh, certainly that. But as I often said, I didn't see it. I never saw a need to defend hip hop. I didn't think hip hop needed defending ever.
Mm,
And by that I mean even when things were in it or current in it that I objected to, you know, I never thought it needed defending, but I did think it needed explanations. I felt like everything in hip hop had an explanation, and that if I were intuitive enough and smart enough and talked to enough people, I could figure out, and talk about what was happening. and that talking about what was happening didn't require, um, one to become hysterical. You know, one could just simply, talk about the social realities of Black people, which are very real,
Mhm.
and they're very real and ongoing. They don't they almost any aspect of them tends to have a very long life. They don't tend to shift a lot. You know, uh, we are kept in a certain place, and the qualities of that place are consistent, which is why you can read the fiction of Richard Wright or other Black authors from decades ago, and it feels very familiar. The words or the specifics, may not, but the general feeling or the frustration that's depicted feels very familiar. Um, so so in terms of hip hop itself, um, I I I I thought I've always thought hip hop is reasonable. It's a reasonable thing, like, and that it that it could be explained or understood. It's a set of outputs from a set of inputs.
That's what you mean by reasonable? Like,
Yes, yes. There's very little noise in the machine. Like if you if you go to a vending machine and order a Three Musketeers bar,
yeah,
Snickers bar comes out. That's kind of reasonable, but not really reasonable. What
yeah.
you really want is a Snickers bar. I mean, a Three Musketeers bar. But if you order a Three Musketeers bar and a glass of champagne comes out, that's not reasonable.
No.
That's not even connected.
Yeah.
Or if a cup of coffee comes out, that's not really even connected to what you wanted. You know, um, hip hop is the way. Hip hop is what you'd expect if you have human beings experiencing what Black people experience. It makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, all of it does.
But then what would you say to the older generation of Black people who didn't understand hip hop and who didn't think of it as something reasonable and they
I'd say they're older.
yeah, they're older.
Yeah,
But because I was gonna say like
and be clear, I'm not saying that all of it is morally good
yeah, yeah.
or what we should be doing ideally. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying it's there's that term they use in programming, garbage in, garbage out.
Mhm.
I'm saying that if you put garbage into people, you're going to get garbage,
Uh
and if you put good things into people, you're going to get good things as well.
yeah,
I'm saying that there's a lot of garbage that goes into our culture and a lot of good things that go into our culture.
yeah.
We just have to be honest about that. Like whatever that whole debate about what the way Black men talk about Black women in records, that precedes hip hop by centuries probably.
Hmm.
And I think that those older people are just not familiar with the forms. They're not familiar with the forms. It's a different kind of culture. Even for myself, for someone who's grown up on this, a lot of the things that I hear or see are are offensive as such. Not offensive like where, but like they don't they don't correlate with how I think the world should work. They're not things I think people should say about each other or the way people should interact or you know. But I get it. I get it. I don't think it's. I think it's reasonable. I think it's reasonable
Mm.
that in the culture we live in, people produce art like this. And Lerone Bennett Jr. once said something that has probably been said more elegantly by any number of people, But he had a book called The Challenge of Blackness. In it, he said the truth of any society is most lived by the man on the bottom. So if you want to know what any society is like, visit the people who are at the bottom of it, and that's what the society is. That's what it really is. And I think that black people tell the truth about what our culture is.